Okay, I would like to go ahead and be punctual and start the meeting 1 minute late. I'm John Rattel, the president of the LGS, and I'd like to introduce Lynn Grossman, who will introduce our speaker. Lynn has been a member of LGS since 1995. She's served as president, vice president, seminar chair, and on the program and celebration committees. So over to you to introduce our speaker, Mr. Prichard.
Okay, welcome to our February program. Today we are asking that those of you who do not expect to have a distraction during this program, like your dog barking or your children descending upon you, to turn your video on during the program. This will allow Mr. Prichard to see his audience. Remember to remain muted during the program. Your questions may be submitted through the chat option at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Betty Graham and I will be reading the questions to Mr. Prichard following his presentation. Today's program, Days of Rage and Sorrow, the Jennie Bowman Riots, presented by James Prichard. This program is both a Victorian true crime story and a glimpse into what was going on in 19th century Louisville. Mr. Prichard returns to LGS for another interesting program. He received his BA and MA from Wright State University and is the author of Embattled Capital, Frankfort, Kentucky in the Civil War. Currently, he is a manuscript cataloger at the Filson Club Historic Society. Mr. Prichard has a varied array of programs to beguile and educate his listeners. Recently, he has been helping the Filson and WHAS to create short videos on the history of Louisville and the Ohio Valley. These videos are designed to give the public a glimpse into our local history and will air on WHAS. Mr. Prichard.
Thanks very much, Lynn. It's good to be back with you all today. You know, virtually every major American city has experienced some type of unrest or rioting. And of course, this is in one sense a very recent memory for Louisville, you know, the events of last summer. But as terrible as those times were, they were in no way comparable to the Bloody Monday riots of 1855, which caused far more extensive property damage and loss of life. And in terms of the number of people involved, the Jennie Bowman riots dwarfed Bloody Monday. We're talking about a mob that was estimated to be over 10,000 strong. So the story begins with a young woman who was born in 1863 in Madison, Indiana. Her family was quite poor. They moved to Louisville in the 1860s, late 1860s, where her mother died. Her father remarried, and she eventually obtained work as a servant, a maid, household servant, working for Absalom Johnson's family at 1322 Brook Street. And Mr. Johnson was the son of, as I understand it, and namesake of Louisville's first fire chief. Well, crime was just as common in the city then as it is now. It was later reported that Jennie was particularly terrified of burglars, and even on the hottest nights, always kept the window to her room bolted shut. Well, one day on April 21st, 1887, her nightmare became reality. Mr. Johnson had left in the morning to go to his office at an insurance company downtown. Mrs. Johnson and the children went to visit a relative around the corner, and Jennie was left alone in their house to perform her cleaning duties and was apparently cleaning in the dining room when she was confronted by a burglar or burglars. And she put up a fight, struck one of the burglars in the face with a glass, shattered and cut him. But she was immediately struck down and beaten beyond recognition with an iron fireplace poker. And from this point, her body was unconscious body was carried from the dining room up to her bedroom, and she was laying across the bed, and the burglars fled. Well, the children came by a few minutes later to get some knitting materials for their mother, and they found the door locked. So they crawled in through an open window, called for Jennie, couldn't find her. Then they heard moans upstairs, went up and saw her lying on her bed. So they went back to their mother, raised the alarm. Doctors were called. Again, she was severely beaten. She had 7 lacerations about her head. Her right jaw was broken. One of her nose was beat completely flat, and one of her eyes was knocked out of its socket. Bear that in mind, because this would be reported in detail in the newspapers. And within a matter of hours, the entire city would be aware of just how vicious this attack was. Well, in a brief lucid moment between shots of morphine and other treatment, she was asked who her attacker was, and she said that it was 2 black men. So immediately, Police Chief John Whalen put out what we would call now a dragnet, an APO, and 2 days later, on April 23rd, Albert Turner was arrested in his apartment downtown. He was a native of Louisville, was born here in 1861 in slavery. After freedom, he worked on the Ohio River and eventually traveled to other cities, and eventually ended up in Chicago. On April 23rd, Albert Turner, who was born in slavery in Louisville in 1861, was arrested in his rooms. He had scratches on his face. He was found to have had property stolen from the Johnson home, and he immediately confessed. So he was taken to the Louisville jail initially and interrogated by Police Chief Whalen. And as I mentioned before, he was not a stranger to trouble, having served time in the Illinois State Penitentiary for robbery. So he was whisked away to Frankfort for safekeeping because talks of lynchings were already underway. And en route there, he implicated that he had an accomplice, William Patterson, who was born in Mississippi in 1855. His mother brought him to Louisville after freedom. He worked odd jobs, but his main employment was as a career criminal. And in early 1887, he was released after serving his 3rd stretch in the Kentucky State Penitentiary for larceny. So both Turner and Patterson were ex-convicts who were recently released from prison. And of course, Patterson had already had a reputation with the Louisville Police Department as, quote, a bad Negro. So he was identified, picked up, taken to Frankfort. Turner identified him, and Patterson denied everything and attempted to physically assault Turner. And what was interesting to me, what happened in the next few hours, was that, of course, mobs began to form outside of the Frankfort jail, and there was talk of lynchings. But an element in Frankfort's African-American community also gathered outside the jail, and they talked among themselves of lynching the 2 men themselves so that their atrocious crime wouldn't reflect poorly on Kentucky's black community. Well, it became too hot in Frankfort to keep the prisoners there, so they were brought back to Louisville City Jail on April 27th. It was located on Jefferson Street in the vicinity of 5th and 6th Street at that time. Almost immediately that night, a mob estimated to be about 5,000 strong surrounded the jail. The next night, April 28th, the mob grew to about 10,000. And then at 2:30 a.m. on the morning of April 29th, 200 men stormed the jail, and Chief Whalen and his police officers repulsed them. They also broke up a large crowd gathering, a large lynch mob, I should say, gathering on Brook Street, where the crime took place. And then there was a second assault on the jail by 700 men and boys, some of them using a telephone pole as a battering ram. And again, the police were able to hold them at bay. But they knew that if they were outnumbered heavily, it was only a matter of time. So they appealed to the circuit judge, who contacted the governor in Frankfurt, and the Louisville Legion, the local state guard, was activated. And I should add that during this initial night of rioting, there was also an attempt to break into the Louisville Legion's armory, and the mob sought to seize the military-style weapons that were housed there. So it was a very volatile situation. Well, the Legion was commanded by then Colonel John B. Castleman. He was a former Confederate cavalry officer, a strict disciplinarian, and the Louisville Legion was probably one of the best state guard units in the state. So on the night of April 29th, as the crowds began to gather again, and again, it was estimated about 10,000 strong, Castleman marched 190 of his men to the entrance of the jail. They also brought along a Gatling gun. And this group was reinforced by the Louisville Light Infantry, which was about 40 strong. So you had over 200 militiamen and over 100 policemen. And the mob once again stormed the jail. The police drove them back, but they called on Castleman for reinforcements. So with drums beating and flag flying, the Louisville Legion marched toward the crowd, stopped. The order was given to present arms and ready to fire. And a participant in the riots later recalled that the sound of those 200 rifles cocking immediately panicked the crowd, and they fled in terror. And this more or less broke the spirit of the mob. But this is one reason, and an important reason, that if you visit the memorial to lynching victims in Montgomery, Alabama today, you will not find a single name of anyone from Louisville on that memorial. And so the local authorities did the right thing. They stood up to the mob, and this lynching attempt was prevented. On May the 9th, Jennie Bowman died of her injuries and was buried in Cave Hill Cemetery the next day. A subscription was taken up. If you visit her gravesite, which is well taken care of, there's a very impressive tombstone in her memory with words to the effect that she died, defending her home or her employer's home. So she got a hero's burial. Shortly afterwards, Albert Turner was tried and convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. It was an open and shut case. He didn't deny his guilt in the courtroom, but for the next several weeks until he was hanged on July 1st, the Jefferson County Jail became sort of the center of spectacle. Albert Turner was determined that when he was laid to rest, he was going to be laid in a fine suit, and he would have an expensive coffin. And so he charged people a nickel or a dime to visit him in his cell, shake his hand, ask him questions, have their pictures taken with him. And boy, I would love to get my hands on one of those pictures if there's any floating around in some attic in Louisville to this day. And people by the hundreds streamed into jail. Another incident that showed me what a character he was is that on the eve of his hanging, he was put on suicide watch, and he asked for a glass of water, and he mixed it with some chalk dust off the wall of his cell, and drank it. And of course, it left a white foam around his mouth. And he pretended to be gasping for air and strangling. And of course, immediately the guard thought that he had taken poison, and he burst into the cell, and immediately Turner jumped up and burst out laughing. When it came to die, he stood on the gallows and gave a very typical speech that was common in Western society, at least from the 18th century, where he didn't deny his crimes, but he regretted what he had done and told everybody to look upon me as an example of what your fate will be if you follow the kind of life that I led. But basically, his countenance was not one of remorse or regret. He was bold and defiant to the end. The last thing he said before the trap was sprung was that William Patterson was innocent. It took him 5 minutes to die. The fall didn't break his neck, but because of his weight, he only strangled for about 5 minutes. And he was taken to a nice burial vault in Eastern Cemetery in his fine suit and fine casket. One of the interesting stories about the aftermath of his death was that his sister held seances. And at one point, they conjured up Albert's spirit and actually his image. And he told them that he was aboard a steamboat that ferried departed souls from earth to heaven, and that his job was the fireman to shovel coal into the furnace. But he also allegedly said that Patterson was actually guilty. And of course, the Patterson family spread this around their neighborhoods. And of course, the Turner family, the Turner family spread this rumor. The Patterson family was very indignant. So it comes to Patterson's trial a short time afterwards. He's found guilty, but he's got some excellent attorneys defending him. So they immediately appeal to the Kentucky Court of Appeals, where on October the 6th of 1887, the lower court conviction was upheld. They then go to Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, a former Major General in the Confederate Army. And Buckner received several letters and petitions from average Louisville citizens, prominent Louisville citizens, some of them ex-Confederate veterans, saying that it really did appear that, Patterson may have been innocent. He gave an alibi that he was working in West Louisville. He at one point stopped a postman and asked him for the time, and they were able to go back and examine the postman's work ledgers to get an approximation of time. I should add that the original attack took place around between 9:30 and 10 in the morning when Jennie was first attacked. Plus, the Louisville Commercial, the city's Republican newspaper, backed Patterson's case. And the Democratic Courier-Journal, of course, waged a war of words with their Republican rivals. Buckner did not take his mission lightly. He issued over 3 respites, postponed the date of execution 3 times. And this was remarkable to me. At one point, the governor left his mansion in Frankfort, traveled to Louisville, and walked over the scene of the crime from where it occurred on Brook Street to the part of Louisville where Patterson said he was doing odd jobs like driving a coal wagon, running errands, and so forth, and timed it with his watch to see if Patterson could have helped commit the murder and then gotten to the other side in time to be seen by these other witnesses. Eventually, Buckner came to the conclusion that he wouldn't intervene. And so Patterson mounted the scaffold, the very same scaffold that Turner was hanged on June 14th, 1888. And of course, in those days, executions were public. It was done in the courtyard of the jail, but people were admitted by tickets, and several hundred people, including newspapermen and other local and prominent citizens, friends of Jennie Bowman, witnessed the execution. Patterson condemned those who brought him to the gallows, denied that he was guilty of murder. He was particularly bitter toward Police Chief Whalen, and he declared, "God is going to hold you all accountable." Well, his death was particularly gruesome and terrible because he only weighed 120 pounds, and the fall did not break his neck, and he strangled to death for several minutes. At one point, he was observed to bring his knees up to his chest and say, "Oh Lord, take me, take me." Well, eventually he passed, and his family had him buried in Eastern Cemetery. And this is one of the sad ironies, particularly where Turner was concerned. in time, the Eastern Cemetery was cared for so poorly that all traces of both their burial spots have disappeared. So even if he was in his fine suit and his fine coffin, his monument for Turner was gone. So the mystery remains, was Patterson guilty? Turner definitely was. And what may have cost Patterson his life was at this particular time, this was the time when telephones were starting to be used in the city. And as a matter of fact, Mrs. Johnson used the telephone to call her husband at his office to come back to the house. And she used the telephone also to call Chief Whalen. But in terms of keeping time, there were two methods by how you set your watch or set your mantle clock, either by solar time or by railroad time. So everybody in the city who gave a time of when the attack took place, gave times of when they saw Patterson in West Louisville, this, that, and the other, were using different variables. So no one knows for sure whether Patterson was guilty. There was blood found on his clothes, but it was claimed by his defense attorney that that was the suit given to him when he left prison, and the previous owner was a noted murderer from Louisville with the colorful name of Mock Turtle, and it was claimed that the blood was from one of Mock Turtle's victims. The only problem with that is there was also blood on Turner's underwear. And Jennie Bowman claimed at one point that the two men who attacked her had briefly discussed assaulting her, sexually assaulting her, and that one had unbuttoned his pants. Well, Patterson's claim to this is that he had been on intimate terms with a married woman earlier in the day before his arrest, and that's how his underwear became soiled. Well, the woman testified at his trial, and whether she was telling the truth or not, she had reason to lie, of course, claimed that she had not seen Patterson that morning. So we may never know the truth. Louisville's old red light district where Patterson lived, which was in the vicinity of Liberty and Floyd, where I-65 overpass is located, was destroyed to construct the highway, the interstate highway in the 60s. The old Johnson home on Brook Street was destroyed. So there's very little left of the crime scene. But if you drive down Kentucky, the old schoolhouse there on the left at the intersection, close to the intersection of Brook and Kentucky, was there at the time of the crime. And if you stop at Brook Street in Kentucky and look to your left, the overpass has a very dark, ominous corner. And that's where the Johnson house stood. So, if you believe in ghosts, and some people claim that the ghost of Jennie Bowman can still be seen walking along Brook Street at night. Well, I've checked the Louisville newspaper databases, and the only time I've ever seen anything like that reported was in very recent times. There have been no traditions in the past about Jennie's ghost until modern times. So, in effect, what really happened that morning, Jennie, Turner, and Patterson took to their graves. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at this point that anybody might have. I should add very quickly that at this time, newspapers were using illustrations. Someday, I've got a PowerPoint presentation which I gave at the Filson in their theater a couple of summers ago. But if you're curious to learn more, just check the Old Courier Journal, and you'll see pen sketches of Jennie, Patterson, Turner, the crime scene, the murder weapon. And if you're really wanting to dig further, you can borrow the Old Police Gazette on interlibrary loan. And there are pictures of Jennie, Patterson, Turner, and other items related to the crime. Police Gazette was sort of a combination of sporting news, true crime, and men's interest. So it's kind of a combination of Sports Illustrated, Esquire, and the old true crime magazine. So you'd always have a coverage of all the major crimes in the nation, all the baseball scores, and then some scantily clad in an 1887 kind of way, chorus girl or theater actress, you know, her corset and tights. So it was sort of, again, a men's magazine. It's kind of not a highbrow, but it contains a lot of good information about crime in American society at that time. Anna,
Hi,
good
Jim.
to see you.
Hi, good. Jim, when did they stop public hanging here? Do you know when the last public hanging was in Louisville?
You mean the public hangings?
Yeah. Did they, how?
The last public hanging in Kentucky took place in Owensboro in 1937. And after that, it was deemed such a unseemly, cruel, business. Then executions took place in the old Jimmy Cagney kind of fashion, where you're executed in the death house in the prison, or hanged in the prison yard, and the public would not be invited.
Interesting.
So fairly recently, when you think about it.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh,
My
gosh.
great-grandmother, when she was a young girl, her parents took her to a hanging in the 1890s because it's a very educational, family-friendly event, to teach your children about the wages of sin. And when the fellow, he was a man that murdered his wife, and when he disappeared through the trapdoor, she fainted. So the impression didn't last very long.
Was that the only
Any other questions?
thing? Was that the only kind of event like that we ever had after the Civil War?
Racial problem.
Riots? Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a long tradition. It goes back to early British history, and I'm sure other European nations. But anytime someone was a pirate or a highwayman or an 11-year-old boy that stole a loaf of bread was hanged, it was always before the public. People snacked, they cheered or booed the victim, sometimes would throw things at them. So it was always a very public spectacle for centuries. When Charles I was executed, after the English Civil War, that was a public event.
I remember now.
Any other questions?
Jim, would you explain to the group this collaboration you have going with WHAS and
Yeah. The Filson WHAS is considering or planning monthly installments, usually for their weekend morning broadcasts. And so they reached out to the Filson for Black History Month, and I gave a talk which aired this past Saturday on Kentuckians on both sides of the color line, African American and white men and women who served time in the Kentucky State Penitentiary for helping slaves to run away. And there were quite a number of them, and a lot of, needless to say, with Louisville being on the Ohio River and Indiana being a free state, there were a lot of people from Louisville, men, women, black and white, that actually served time. Some of the sentences were quite lengthy. The maximum sentence was 20 years at hard labor. So that was the first talk. But from here on out, members of the Filson staff are going to be interviewed on various topics, related to women's history, Kentucky Derby, you name it, anything to do with history of Louisville and the Ohio River Valley. So that'll be a regular feature in the months ahead.
But they're just gonna do that on the weekend, the Saturday and Sunday broadcast?
Yeah, they've got a Louisville Awake, I think it's called, or Wake Up Louisville. And I'm a late riser, so I didn't get up to watch the 5 a.m. Saturday
Right.
broadcast, but I managed to drag myself out of bed for the 9 a.m. And there might have been another airing later that day, maybe in the evening. I'm not sure. So you get a couple of opportunities, at least maybe 3 over the weekend to catch it.
I'm really surprised that that kind of thing hasn't been done before.
Yeah, it's we've done these types of things in the past, but it's just been kind of hit and miss. You know, something will happen, and the media will take an interest. So, local public radio or local television or the Courier Journal will, you know, contact us and ask if somebody on the staff is familiar with the subject, and you know, if we'd be willing to grant an interview. Oh, yeah. Someone asked a question about John B. Castleman. This is the same John B. Castleman whose statue was removed from Cherokee Triangle, and which to me was a little bit ironic because, you know, he was primarily responsible for preventing lynchings, not only in Louisville in his capacity as a state guard commander, but in 2 or 3 other Kentucky communities in the 1880s, I should say. After that, he became a general in the American Army and Spanish-American War. So yes, it's same Castleman, yes.
One other people asked who the governor was, and I think you mentioned it was Simon Bolivar Butler. Was he the
Buckner? Yes.
He was the governor during the whole time of this.
Yeah, he was.
He was the only governor, even though I think
this is another note of irony. You know, he was a Confederate major general. He came from a prominent slave-owning family, so he was a Confederate veteran. Police Chief Whalen was a Confederate veteran. John B. Castleman was a Confederate veteran. And the mayor of Louisville at that time, whose name escapes me, was a Confederate veteran. And I thought it was so ironic that these ex-Confederates were the main bulwarks against the lynch mob and the prisoners in the jail. So history is a lot more complicated than we're led to believe sometimes. Just Stone Turner, but they really supported Patterson. And, you know, again, the Louisville Commercial, the Louisville Republican Party, and local Republican politicians all supported Patterson and believed that there wasn't really enough evidence to convict him.
Did they often allow people to go into the jail and have their pictures taken?
Yes. Yeah, they all lined up, you know, like they were in line for admission to a movie theater. And this would be people of all ranks of society, society ladies, you know, wanting to get a glimpse of these ruthless murderers. So yeah, they went in and got his autograph, had their pictures taken with him. So it was quite a kind of a circus atmosphere. At one point, he peeped out of his jail cell, a Turner that is, and again emphasized that he wanted to be buried properly. And he told his family that if he wasn't buried properly, he would come back and haunt them. And an elderly black woman in the crowd fainted, screamed and fainted. So again, he was a vicious criminal, pretty colorful character.
He was a most unusual person.
Put it mildly. Yeah, he had, I should add also that he confessed that he had brutally attacked a streetcar conductor and robbed him. Someone else was convicted of the crime and sent to prison. And so Turner confessed that he was the one. So the one good deed that he did was that the man that was wrongly convicted for the streetcar conductor attack was released from his cell.
Thank heavens they hadn't already taken care of him.
Mm,
I think Ann still had a question.
yeah.
I
And
just sent it through chat.
Why don't you go ahead and ask it?
I will. I don't
Well,
know. Come on.
I think someone's asking about ex-Confederates in public office in Louisville, and it did not hurt. And you had a lot of prominent ex-Confederates that became members of the United States Congress, like W.C.P. Breckinridge of Lexington, or senators like John S. Williams of Mount Sterling, or governor like Luke Blackburn, James McCreary, Simon Bolivar Buckner. But you know, the Republican Party was definitely a minority party in Kentucky at that time. And so again, President Lincoln's anti-slavery steps gave Democrats the upper hand, because Kentucky Unionists, who later became Republicans, were just as angry at President Lincoln as the ex-Confederates were. Because most people aren't aware, if you were a Union man in Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, you weren't fighting against slavery. You were fighting to restore the Union. And so most Kentucky Unionists were fighting for the old Union. The campaign slogans were the Union as it was. So that's the Union of Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, compromise with slavery intact. So Kentuckians of both sides, but particularly the Republicans, felt betrayed by the Lincoln administration after slavery was destroyed. So that gave the Democrats and ex-Confederates the edge. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely check out the YouTube presentation on that.
yeah, for anybody that didn't see that, the presentation will be posted on LGS YouTube channel. Jim was gracious enough to allow that. So we will look forward to other viewings of it, because some of the people who registered were not able to come today, and they will view it on YouTube. We also had someone make a comment. The problem was very interesting. I'm glad I stumbled onto your society. It is so sad to me that we are tearing down statues so indiscriminately. I guess that we all need to learn from history and hear it all, not just part of it. And,
yeah, this is where I take my Filson cap off and to speak to you as Jim. But I was very much against the removal of the Castleman statue. And actually, I'm one of the litigants in the lawsuit that was filed by Steve Weiser's organization. It's currently being viewed by the Court of Appeals. But I thought it was an over-emotional reaction to the real problems that we face as a society. And it really, in my view, my own personal view, again, I'm not representing the Filson, we were neutral during the controversy, and I actually assisted people that were pro-removal or anti-removal with source material. But it wasn't a Confederate monument. It was erected in gratitude by city officials, ministers, members of the Jewish community, Catholic community, and appreciation of his civic duty to the city, such as his state guard service and his work with the city parks. So there wasn't any kind of Confederate or United Daughters of Confederacy connection with it at all. But because of the times and the raw emotions that we've all been experiencing, it became a target, and other statues as well.
Anne, did you want to read your comment or?
I wanted everyone to know that there are wonderful articles in the Courier Journal during Black History Month. Each day they focus on a certain person who was prominent in the Black community or helped advance the Black community in the past. And I'm sure you can pull it up online, even if you don't get the Courier, you could Google it. They're really good articles. Today was about Mr. Parrish, who founded Simmons College. And there's been one about Mr. Blue, Reverend Blue, who was the founder of the first colored branch of the library. It goes on like that. It's good to know.
Does anybody else have a question? I guess that's it. Unless you have some more comments, Jim.
I was going to say, I always thoroughly enjoy the opportunity to visit you folks. I look forward to working with you again. If anybody has any questions about this particular subject or really anything to do with Kentucky history or Louisville history, just go to the Filson website and check on the staff directory. You could email me and I'd be happy to help you out with any reference questions you might have. If I don't know the answer, there'll be somebody at the Filson who will.
Mr. Prichard, John Rattel, our president, I want to, on behalf of the entire LGS, I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation that you made.
Well, again, it's my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the future, not too distant future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would like to thank our audience, and we look forward to seeing all of you back on the 23rd of February when Kurt Witcher from Allen County Library will be talking about their genealogy center resources and how things have changed. So don't forget to register for that program on the website. John?
Okay, I think we'll say the meeting's over. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.